Hey guys, welcome to my newest video where I'll be going over all of my Nintendo DS collection. Now there's quite a lot more to go over in this video, so each entry will be a bit shorter, but I'll still show gameplay for all of them. So let's just get on with it, shall we? Before we get started, just a quick disclaimer. A lot of the video game footage you're going to see today is from emulation because I don't have the ability to capture footage from DS consoles, unfortunately.
The people of my world were forbidden from traveling the gulfs of space. But I never stopped looking up and dreaming of the stars.
This is a sci-fi RPG developed by Platinum Games and released in Japan in 2009 and the West in 2010. The story is epic in scope for a DS game, set in a future where humanity has mastered intergalactic travel and has explored beyond the Milky Way into the small and large Magellanic Clouds. The main character is Yuri, who, while stuck on his home planet, dreams of a life of space exploration. He inevitably eventually finds a way off the planet and goes on an adventure that takes in large parts of the galaxy, with a lot of twists and turns, and some important decisions to make. Overall, the game will take you about 40 hours to beat, which is quite sizable for a DS game. The gameplay is a mix of pre-planned and random spaceship battles, which use a real-time tactical system. There's also quite an extensive ship customization feature, which is done by arranging blocks on a grid and provides a good level of complexity and depth to the game. Overall, this is a very unique title, and one well worth having in your collection. This is probably the easiest way to own a physical copy of the legendary Chrono Trigger, in the UK at least. The SNES version was never released in PAL territories, and importing it from the US is very expensive. The DS version is also arguably the definitive way to experience Chrono Trigger, with some exclusive side quests, an art gallery, and a music player. The game also looks really good on the DS screen, especially on a new 3DS XL. Everyone is aware of the legacy of this game, and I'm happy to say that it holds up even today, with an interesting story, lovely sprite graphics, an excellent soundtrack, and an engaging turn-based battle system. A remake of the original SNES version, which was only released in Japan, Dragon Quest VI Realms of Reverie, to use its full title, is a relatively traditional, straightforward Dragon Quest game, with its unique mechanic being swapping between the real world and the dream world, a bit like the light and dark worlds in A Link to the Past. In terms of presentation, it's nearly exactly the same as the other two remakes for DS, Dragon Quest IV and V, and the story is nothing particularly unique either, with all the typical tropes of a Dragon Quest game. Ultimately, if you're a Dragon Quest fan, you know what you're getting with these games, and Dragon Quest VI is no exception. Heart Gold and Soul Silver are widely regarded to be the best Pokemon remakes, and some people consider them to be the best Pokemon games of all time. Perhaps because of this, they're also some of the most expensive Pokemon games you can buy on any console. The original Pokemon Heart and Silver are great games, but Heart Gold and Soul Silver earned their reputation as the best remakes through advancements such as partner Pokemon, graphical improvements, a remastered soundtrack, and an expanded post-game. Don't get me wrong, Heart Gold and Soul Silver are brilliant Pokemon remakes, which added a lot to a series which was already great, and they are some of my favourite Pokemon games, but they're not without issue. There are some occasions when there's a large jump in levels between gym battles, requiring you to grind. The distribution of Pokemon feels a bit off as well, especially in the early game, when there's little variation in what you come across. A lot of the Pokemon that gym trainers use come from Kanto and not Johto. It would have been nice to see some more representation from Johto, but still, battling Red will be an all-time highlight in Pokemon for me, and the ability to go back to Kanto and experience the first generation all again is such a nostalgia trip. Diamond and Pearl had a lot of issues, but Pokemon Platinum provided the ultimate refinement of the Generation 4 games, with better pacing, redesigned gyms, and the best of all, the Battle Frontier, which gave Platinum one of the best post-games of any Pokemon entry. However, there are still problems that Platinum wasn't able to iron out. The story is still a bit crazy, and it's out of sync with other Pokemon games, and the game still runs slow as molasses on the DS. Because it's so much better than Diamond and Pearl, Platinum has become somewhat collectible, and is the most expensive of the three on the system. Now for the 5th generation of Pokemon games, and the second mainline entries to release on the Nintendo DS. These were unique in that they were the first to force you to use the new roster of Pokemon, with 156 new Pokemon that were all you had until you beat the Elite Four. For me, this made Pokemon Black one of my favourite Pokemon experiences since Red and Blue. I've always struggled with choosing a new Pokemon. Why pick Hoot Hoot when you can have Pidgey, for example? With Black, this problem was eliminated, as you're forced to use the new Pokemon. This made me actually learn their names and remember their typing better. It also helps that Black has probably the best story of any Pokemon game. I'm not saying it's prize-winning stuff, but there's at least the concept of a good story here, and this is probably the first and only time when I've really empathised with and understood where the bad guys were coming from. Miles Edgeworth is the first of 2 spin-off games from the Ace Attorney series, which see you playing as the titular prosecutor instead of the usual defense attorney. The gameplay is slightly different to the usual entries in the series, with a focus on investigation of the crime scene instead of the courtroom, almost like a point-and-click adventure game, before a rebuttal phase which is more reminiscent of the mainline games. Edgeworth is on the easier side as a whole, although there are a few puzzles which left me stumped. The solutions to these puzzles can sometimes be frustratingly obtuse, and sometimes I felt as if I had a valid solution, but because it was not the right solution that the game wanted, it wasn't permitted. In its presentation, Miles Edgeworth is on a par with the rest of the Ace Attorney series, which I think look their best on the DS. The more modern versions look a bit too clean for my eyes. The writing and narrative are also as good as we've come to expect from this series. Overall, it's a worthwhile spin-off to have. For some reason, Miles Edgeworth is quite collectible as well, and I think the price has recently come down, but it retails for about £60 to £70. The first portable Animal Crossing, although not a looker by today's standards, back when it was released it was quite impressive that Nintendo managed to squeeze an entire Animal Crossing game onto a portable cartridge. And make no mistake, this was a full-fat Animal Crossing game on the go. You could do everything you could do in the GameCube version, and even more, with new features like being able to change your hair, customize your town, crossbreed flowers. A bunch of characters which would become staples were also introduced in this entry, including Celeste. The music and cozy vibes also give Wild World a unique nostalgic charm amongst Animal Crossing games. The dialogue, the villagers, were more realistic. They were able to be rude and challenge the player. They felt more like real friends than the characters in New Horizons, who almost feel like they're afraid to insult you and overcompensate by being super polite and complimentary. The DS Animal Crossing is a unique entry into the Animal Crossing universe, and it's still worth revisiting as a sort of time capsule to a simpler time. It's probably the most convenient way of experiencing Animal Crossing the way it was originally intended. As far as I'm aware, 3 original Castlevania games were released for the DS, which is far more than you can say for the Switch, and I own 2 of them. I've only played Dawn of Sorrow, which is a pretty good Castlevania by my book. The controls are tight, and there's a cool system which allows you to mix and match souls that you find, which give you special abilities. The music and graphics, as always, are on point, and it's personal preference, but I prefer the more anime styling of the DS games to the GBA titles. The only drawback is with the touchscreen implementation. You have to draw insignias on the bottom screen in certain scenes, and this can be quite fiddly. If you get it wrong, you can be pushed backstage during boss fights, which is quite frustrating. You only have a limited time window as well. Still, Dawn of Sorrow is one of the best Castlevania games in the series, and you can't go wrong with the fact that it's literally Castlevania DS. People who've played Portrait of Ruin, how does it hold up? Is it better than Dawn of Sorrow? Let me know in the comments. The Pokemon Ranger series is exclusive to the Nintendo DS, and I happen to have the first 2 of them. In Pokemon Ranger, you play as a Pokemon Ranger. Funny that. These games play very differently to the mainline entries, involving a mission-based system, and they require the use of the stylus to capture Pokemon. Watch you don't damage your screen. The story is actually pretty good, but the implementation of the stylus, which is arguably Ranger's defining feature, feels like a gimmick, and that it was made to promote the DS, rather than from a purely gameplay-orientated development standpoint. Ranger and Shadows of Almia, which is the second game, both sold quite well, around 3 million and 2 million respectively. Because of that, they aren't particularly expensive to pick up. Ranger even comes in a nice shiny case. Shadow Dragon is the only Fire Emblem entry on the DS, in the West at least. It's a remake of an old NES game, and although I love Fire Emblem, it can show its age in terms of systems and map design, which are sometimes quite simple. Having said that, it was the first Fire Emblem to introduce reclassing, and it's also an accessible game, which inroads the player well. It makes good use of the dual screens, the battle takes place on the bottom screen, tutorials and battle animations take place on the top screen. The graphical style is a bit at odds with other Fire Emblem games, especially compared to the more anime leanings that would come later with Awakening. This might be why some people find this one hard to go back to, and it might be why it's one of the less popular entries in the Fire Emblem series. The story is generic Fire Emblem stuff, nothing special there. In terms of collectability, Shadow Dragon has become one of the more expensive DS titles, although I think as with all retro games, it's recently come down in price slightly and you can pick it up for about £65. One of 2 Zelda entries on the DS, Phantom Hourglass is a sequel to Wind Waker and has a similar cel-shaded graphical style. The unique thing about the Zelda games on the DS is that you move Link with the stylus. Hold a direction and Link will walk that way. So in a way, it feels like you're leading Link rather than playing as him. In combat, you tap on enemies with the stylus to attack them. I think it's personal preference, but I never got used to either of these mechanics, and I think it's why Phantom Hourglass is one of the lowest ranking Zelda games in most people's lists. However, there was one way that I think they used the stylus quite well, in the item design and puzzle implementation. For example, to use the boomerang, you draw a route with your stylus, and it just gives you more flexibility and control over where the boomerang goes. The grappling hook is another good example. You use the stylus to draw a rope to a point, and then you can walk along the rope. Having said all that, this isn't a great Zelda game. The soundtrack is forgettable, the overworld is frustrating, and the dungeon design is lacking. This is a Pokemon spin-off title in the Mystery Dungeon style, which for those who don't know consists of randomly generated dungeons with tile floor maps, which you move through in a turn-based system. In this game, you're a human who's turned into a Pokemon. The type of Pokemon you become will be determined by a personality test that you take at the start of the game. Although if you're unhappy with your outcome, you can just choose another, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. You join a guild of Pokemon explorers and take missions which involve going into the dungeons and finding lost items or Pokemon. There's quite a surprisingly deep and involved story, probably better than most mainline Pokemon games. There's also quite a lot of charm in playing as a Pokemon, seeing all the different Pokemon with their different jobs that are unique to their their design, I suppose. Explorers of Sky is the definitive version of Explorers of Time and Darkness, with a bunch of added features and some new story content. It's considered by many to be the best in the Mystery Dungeon series, and it's definitely worth a look. I think it costs about £70, complete in box. This one is an oddity, a typing game for the DS which came with its own wireless keyboard, and the wireless keyboard doesn't work with any other DS game, which was kind of a strange choice by Nintendo when you think about it. Even in 2005, typing games were kind of a thing of the past, but Nintendo decided to release a Pokemon one anyway. The game only lasts for about 2 hours and has you typing the name of Pokemon to capture them. It's not a serious spin-off, but it's something fun for the collection, and it's not too expensive either. I also think in the future this one might become quite collectible. It's just something a bit strange, isn't it, having a keyboard for the DS. The game also does have a character called Quentin Wurty, which I think is quite funny. A remake of Kirby Star Ultra for the SNES, Superstar Ultra is an anthology of games best thought of as different modes, some of which are remakes of older games and some of which are new entirely. Some of the new modes are excellent, like Helper to Hero and the True Arena, which both provide more of a challenge than normal Kirby and encourage repeated playthroughs. Meta Nightmare Ultra is also a personal favourite of mine. Unfortunately, this game has become quite expensive in the UK, and that's why I've imported my copy from the US, as you can see. This is an RPG from Atlas, which received a remake on the 3DS. The remake is apparently the much better version, but it's also one of the most expensive games on the 3DS, and so I've gone for the NTSC original. I haven't gotten around to playing it yet, but I'm interested by what I've seen in the gameplay. Maybe let me know down in the comments if this one's worth. It's Pokemon, but it's Fire Emblem. This is a very weird spin-off, but it's one that's actually right up my alley. It's a Pokemon tactics game set in feudal era Japan, with warlords being based on real historical figures. And when you think about it, Pokemon makes a really good choice for a tactics game, because most people would have already played at least one Pokemon game. They'll inherently understand the mechanics and abilities, which translate quite well into a tactics system. And the game does a good job of combining the systems of Pokemon and Nobunaga's Ambition, the series in which the tactics gameplay is based on. There are a few issues which are quite notable, like the limited selection of Pokemon. I think there's around 200 out of about 600 which were available at the time. There's some pacing issues where it drags in points, and the fact that a lot of the meat of the game isn't made available until the post-game, which most people won't see, but it's still an interesting spin-off that was never explored again by the Pokemon Company, and it's exclusive to the Nintendo DS. Following on from the first two entries on the GBA, Dual Strike is a direct continuation of the story, with the same cast of characters. There are 28 levels overall, including a couple of bonus missions. The gameplay is largely the same, however now there is a new feature called Second Front, where two battles are shown simultaneously, one on the bottom screen and one on the top screen. A few extra modes were also added, like the new survival mode, where the player is given a set number of resources and must complete a series of maps. Overall, Dual Strike is a great continuation of the Advance Wars series, and in my opinion isn't talked about enough when people talk about that franchise. It's more of the same approach, could be construed in a negative way, but as the old saying goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Time Hollow is a visual novel published by Konami and written by the same guy who did the PS2 game Shadow of Memories. In the story, you play as Ethan, whose parents mysteriously disappear on his 17th birthday. Following this, Ethan finds a magic pen which allows him to open portals into the past. Being a visual novel, the gameplay isn't too involved. You use the stylus to draw circles on the screen and create these time portals, and by doing so you can alter the past and change the present. Based on what parts of the story you discover and how you change the events, there are several minor changes in the story as you progress, and these can add up to give quite different endings to the game. Time Hollow is quite short, coming in at around 2 hours per run, and because of this it lends itself to repeated playthroughs. It's a niche DS game and a bit of a hidden gem, especially if you like visual novels. Partners in Time is a sequel to the GBA entry in the Mario & Luigi series, Superstar Saga. continuing the story of the Mario brothers in quite a serious and dark story, by Mario standards anyway. It involves time travel, an alien invasion, and as always, the abduction of Princess Peach. In the game, instead of just controlling Mario and Luigi, you also control Baby Mario and Baby Luigi in a quartet, solving puzzles and taking part in turn-based battles. The game is actually quite challenging for a Mario and Luigi title. The visual style is an evolution of the GBA entry, with clean sprites and beautiful backgrounds, and I think it's quite a nice looking game. Partners in Time is probably my favourite of the Mario and Luigi series. Unfortunately, it didn't sell that well, and it didn't receive the 3DS remake treatment either, so it's still exclusive to the DS, but fortunately it's not too expensive to pick up. So there you have it, that's my entire Nintendo DS collection. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe. And if you want to see something similar, I recently released a video going over my GBA collection. Thanks for watching.